Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, "Look, here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will be not enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridegrooms came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." The word of the Lord.
As Dave said, I'm Carrie. Thank you for having had me here for the past couple months. It's a real pleasure to get to preach today. A lot of you don't know a lot about me, but something that is true about me is that I love lists. I don't know if any of you love lists. I hope so. Yes, at least one person. Great. So I love a good list. I love writing everything down, getting it out of my head and onto paper, knowing exactly what there is to do, and the satisfaction of checking off each item one by one until finally everything is complete. There's a sense of rightness and sanctity in completing a good list. In our passage today from Amos, the Israelites have completed their to-do as followers of God checklist and are looking forward to the day of the Lord, feeling overly certain of their preparedness. They've checked everything off their list. Celebrate holy festivals, check. Burnt offerings, check. Grain offerings, check. Fatted animal offerings, check. Songs to God, including harp, check. They are feeling productive and good about the fact that they did all that they needed to do to fulfill the great calling and responsibility God has handed them as his chosen people. Imagine their surprise then when Amos comes along and is like, "Hey, you've got the wrong list." Actually, there isn't really a list at all because none of this is that simple. He essentially picks up their sacred to-do list and rips it in front of their faces. See, as an outsider who lived between the lands of Judah and Israel, Amos had watched as King Jeroboam II had allowed idolatry and injustice to take root in Israel and its people, thus morphing them into beings who would no longer be recognized on the day of the Lord. This is why Amos has come to Israel, to warn God's people of all the ways they are not holding up their end of the bargain of their covenant with God. This is why at the beginning of our passage in verse 18, Amos is telling the Israelites they are indeed foolish to be hoping for and anticipating the day of the Lord, because they aren't actually in the right standing with God that they think they are. Amos then paints a picture of a man escaping one danger, a lion, only to be met by another, a bear, and then finally reaching the safety of his house, where he is then bit by a snake. We can almost see the man panting with relief from escaping the bear and the lion as he steadies himself against the wall, but instead of reaching safety, his world goes dark as he's bit by the snake. So also for the Israelites, instead of anticipated brightness of God's appearing, there will only be darkness. So what exactly is it the Israelites have done wrong? They checked off all the items on their followers of God to-do list. What is it that Amos is seeing that we are not? Well, if we go back earlier in chapter 5, prior to where this morning's passage puts us, Amos has called out the injustice of Israel's so-called justice system. Verse 7 says that they have turned justice to wormwood and laid righteousness to rest. implying that they have literally let justice rot and righteousness die. The passage goes on to say that the Israelites have unfairly taxed the poor and have relished in the riches that they have made from the suffering of others. They have accepted bribes and ignored truth in the courts. So while they may have checked off their own personal sanctity checklists, they most certainly have not lived out that sanctity within their community and context. Our passage goes so far as to say that God hates the Israelites' worship. This is because of the disconnect we see between their worship and their interaction with other people when looking at the passage in a larger context. Amos offers that Israel needs to instead let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Prolific 19th and 20th century Austrian philosopher, author, and activist Martin Buber suggests that justice and righteousness are not behavioral goals, but rather gifts from God to which Israel must respond. Righteousness, coming from the Hebrew word tzedakah, is a standard of right and equitable relationship, regardless of social standing. Again, that's a standard of right, equitable relationship, regardless of social standing. Justice, then, coming from the Hebrew word mishpat, is concrete action to correct injustice and create righteousness. So concrete action to correct injustice and create a standard of right, equitable relationship, regardless of social standing. The Israelites, and we as modern followers of God, must not only accept these gifts from God, but allow them to affect our relationship with God and each other. Real relationship with God should change how we exist in all other relationships. Thus, true worship of God should always lead to justice, righteousness, and loving of neighbor. Martin Buber says in one of his most popular writings, a book called I and Thou, that this sort of right relationship exists only when we stop thinking of our relationships in terms of I and it, a relationship between a subject and an object, and instead shift into thinking I and thou, which results in a relationship between two subjects. This produces the equitable relationship that is required for true righteousness to exist. As someone who personally loves words and language as a whole, this sort of grammatical clocking of relationship is really interesting to me and was quite eye-opening in this regard. For those who are perhaps a little less nerdy or less grammatically inclined, I offer up an equally eye-opening term I learned during a stay in the Zulu Hills of South Africa, Ubuntu. While the concept fits so nicely into one Xhosa word, it takes a few more words to understand in English. Ubuntu was explained to me as my well-being is wrapped up in your well-being, or more simply put, that I am because we are. This intrinsically changes the way relationship must occur. If your well-being is wrapped up in my own well-being, or the well-being of those I'm close to, then I won't let you go hungry. I won't let you go without a home, or overtax you, or underpay you, or vote for people whose policy harms you. If your well-being is wrapped up in my well-being, I see you as my equal, as a thou, not an it, another subject in the dialogue instead of an object to be used for my personal gain, success, or holiness. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering somewhere in the back of your mind, how the heck does this connect to the gospel reading today from Matthew, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids? We've just spent all this time talking about how God is less interested in our personal sanctity and more interested in our living out of right relationship and faith in context. Then along comes this parable that seems to smash all of that to pieces, saying those who have prepared themselves by carrying extra oil, notably not sharing it with those who are running out of oil, are rewarded by getting to take part in the wedding procession and party to follow. At first, I wasn't sure I saw the righteousness and justice in that at all. Why should half the group be left behind? Why couldn't the 5 who had oil just share with those who didn't? I needed a bit more context to begin to understand more fully. At the time of this story, there was a sort of ritual that existed where the groom would visit the bride and her family at her home, and then after nightfall, the whole bridal party would process from the bride's home to the groom's. There was not a precise time set for the procession to occur, as the couple would often get held up for unpredictable amount of times for the festivities at the bride's house, kind of like a Midwestern goodbye. This meant that the rest of the bridal party was left waiting indefinitely for the procession to begin. So reasonably, this parable starts with the 10 bridesmaids falling asleep. It's not an issue, though, because they all are awoken when the person comes calling that the procession is ready to begin. Where the issue does come in is that due to the long period of waiting, their oil lamps are burning low. Half of the bridesmaids anticipated this, bringing extra oil with them, while the other half did not. At this point, my thought process is going, well, 5 lamps should be enough to guide 10 of them to the wedding. Why don't they just share? But it was custom at the time that anyone who showed up to the procession or the groom's home without a burning lamp would be assumed to be a party crasher and would be turned away as a stranger from the celebration. This is why it becomes infinitely more important that all 10 bridesmaids have enough oil to keep their lamps burning. This is why, when asked to share oil, the 5 who have extra cannot share, for fear that in distributing the oil, all of their lights will burn out before arriving at the groom's home. So sadly, the 5 unprepared bridesmaids are left to try to find a place to buy oil in the middle of the night. When they unsuccessfully show up to the groom's home later, and with unlit lamps, the groom turns them away. For if they were truly his friends and loved ones, they would have been prepared and arrived when he had called for the procession to begin. While this is not perhaps the outcome or happy ending that I personally would hope for, I do suppose that it is just, as those who were prepared and obedient were rewarded, those who weren't were not, all in accordance with social standards and customs for the practice. It's as if we were assigned a homework assignment, and you did it and received full points for it, and I did not and received none. It's not gonna feel good for me, but it's the just consequence for our actions. So perhaps God's justice, too, is not always as satisfying or fulfilling as I want it to be. But my conflict transformation studies from undergrad are whispering in the back of my head that there are more questions that need to be asked here. Why didn't the 5 bridesmaids have more oil? Could they not afford it? Was it not easy to access? Is it their first time joining the ritual, so they didn't know any better? If they were bridesmaids, even if they showed up without a lamp, wouldn't the groom know them and let them in? I will be careful here to pause and remember that parables are simple stories meant to illustrate a lesson, and are never meant to be the whole story or encompass all we are meant to know as believers. Thus, I will hold to the reminder not to make this parable something it's not. It is meant to illustrate what verse 13 says. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Meaning that we must be ever ready for the coming of Christ, never knowing when, where, or how it will occur. But I wonder also if we might draw a connection back to our Amos text as inspiration for what our preparedness for Christ's coming should look like. If we apply our I and thou, Ubuntu way of living and thinking about preparing to process with our bridegroom one day, let us think not only of our own oil supplies, but the supplies of all people. What might we do to make oil more easily accessible? How might we better educate those who do not know the rules of the procession so that they too are prepared? Might we even progress beyond needing oil lamps altogether, moving forward into a more sustainable practice? I may personally even go so far as to dare to believe that if we have done all the work we have the capacity to do and someone is still left without oil, that perhaps our groom will have the grace and mercy to welcome even those without lit lamps into the celebration. So thinking through my writing a sermon to-do list, we have an intro, check. Amos passage, check. Matthew passage, check. Exegesis, check. Application, check. Seems that all that's left is to offer a conclusion. Wrapping everything up into a nice takeaway, a little doggy bag for you to bring home. So today, take with you the knowledge that God deeply loves you and has given you the gifts of justice and righteousness. It is your choice what to do with those gifts, but I would encourage you to leave the checklist behind and pursue true worship in messy, challenging, rich, passionate, lovely relationship with all of God's creation.